All right, let's look at how Robin's ideas can be applied to the case of slavery and race relations today. So here we have our status hierarchy. So we have the white slave owner up here, higher status individual in the middle 1800s, and we have the slave down here. Now, the way the institution of slavery was working at the time was that any white person could be a slave owner, right? And so theoretically, even this poor white guy down here, were he to become a little bit more wealthy, he too would have the opportunity to own a slave. Now, Cory Robin argues that was sort of important because if you think about why would the poor white individuals endorse slavery, right, when otherwise they might have more in common with the poor black individuals, right, due to their poverty. Robin argues, well, this idea of the potential to be a slave owner was appealing to the white man. So while the material condition of the poor white man and the slave might be similar, or at least on par, right? So the ability to get food and shelter, etc. The symbolic condition was very different. Whites enjoyed superior status in society to blacks. And so Cory Robin argues that that fact helps explain why there was more wide endorsement of slavery, right? Because you might think, well, you know, who owned, only the slave owners maybe really would endorse slavery, but no, a lot of other white individuals did as well. And one explanation for that would be because they saw themselves in a superior status. The institution of slavery gave them a symbolic superiority, right? And they could think to themselves, well, someday, if I just get enough cash, right, I'll be able to have my own slave. But now let's think about what happened over time as slavery ended and blacks were moving up the social hierarchy, right? So let's imagine the leapfrogging here. This poor white guy down here staying in the relative position, but some blacks are moving up in society, right? So remember, in the past, the material conditions might have been similar, but the symbolic favored the white individual. But now, right, that same poor white guy is perceiving a different state of affairs. Some black individuals may actually at this point be seen as having an improved economic condition. Furthermore, in the society where government programs are targeting minorities, giving preference to minorities like affirmative action programs, the white individual is going to see that as a complete reversal of the previous condition. In the past, they had the privileged status in society, right? And now it seems to be reversed because the government is giving preference to minorities as opposed to the white individual. So Robbins thinks that one of the key things about conservatism is this felt loss. It's this, the white plantation owners were losing something. And even the poor whites who didn't have enough money to have a slave, they too were losing something when slavery was abolished. They were losing some of their symbolic superiority, right? And for Cory Robin, this sense of loss, right, is one of the key aspects of conservatism and the reactions that conservative movements generate in response to these emancipation movements. Today, we can see some of the similar patterns. If we ask the question, we should make every effort to improve the position of minorities, even if it means preferential treatment. So that's a question posed to people, and here's the breakdown. In 1987, 33% of Democrats endorsed that, only 15% of Republicans. So even back in the past, you see this difference here. Democrats are more accepting. They are more embracing of efforts to improve the status of minorities. But over time, it has actually diverged, right? So you see increasing support among Democrats for that role of government and decreasing support for Republicans. Again, then, Cory Robbins is going to say that this is indicative of the reaction to the emancipation projects, that conservatism involves this felt loss, and then there is a justification for the hierarchy that has been lost. Now, today we know conservatives will not explicitly endorse, white superiority over blacks, but that's why today researchers are interested in symbolic racism, the idea that policy preferences are being influenced by either masked or unconscious implicit attitudes, or the policy preference is just inauthentic. Okay, let's take a look at the case of the workplace then. So remember we said that in the factory, right, with the labor movement, business owners lost the right to set hours and wages and working conditions. So another form of loss, right? And so the conservative movement is going to be responding, right, to the labor movement. And so remember, Cory Robin argues that conservatism really gets energized every time there is a democratic social movement that is trying to liberate or emancipate people from their kind of subordinate status in the hierarchy in society. But so let's take the business case here, and let's ask the question then, what about the role of state intervention here? And here we'll see the differences between the conservatives and liberals again. We've already learned that the conservatives are against state intervention, right? Because they see that as a constraint on liberty. The liberty of owners, employers, and employees to work out their situation. Right? So in a free market, if the worker will accept the wage and work in that factory, even if it's the most dangerous place on earth, well, that's what freedom is that two free individuals making a voluntary contract, right? And so any kind of state intervention, any kind of minimum wage laws or safety regulations or any kind of that nonsense for the conservative is a constraint on liberty. Now, liberals, on the other hand, have justified state intervention for a couple of reasons, and Robin, in his essays, identifies three. The first two are what you commonly hear from liberals and the ones we've studied, right? That the idea of state intervention can be justified because it's going to protect workers from market failures. So suppose there's a market crash or there's a recession. See, then the state can come in and provide unemployment insurance, right? So you get your unemployment check, or maybe you get job retraining, right? Another liberal justification for state intervention would be the redistribution function of government. So if the market system is producing inequalities in income, the tax system can help to even that out, right? So progressive taxes will channel some resources from the top end of the economic ladder down to the bottom end. And those are often voiced by liberals to defend state intervention. And that's kind of the way we've already learned that. But Robin introduces another way of looking at it, and this is what I wanted to point out with his take on this. He argues that these two over here are sort of passive understandings of freedom. Remember, we talked about freedom from poverty, freedom from ill health, and so on. That's the freedom from frame. But for Robin, that it frames citizens as passive and weak, kind of waiting for government handouts, right? So he doesn't prefer this framing of freedom as a justification for state intervention. Rather, he wants to see the role of the state here the way the abolitionist might, that what state can be is an ally to help workers be liberated from their private rulers, right? The employers, the business owners, who would otherwise set wages and working conditions however they like. Robin argues that liberals would do well to reframe freedom in terms of liberation, right? Not just freedom from, poverty and starvation and so on, but rather freedom to have a voice in the workplace, right? To negotiate wages, to negotiate workplace conditions and so on. And so the regulations and the supporting negotiating, bargaining policies and so on for unions and environmental regulations in the workplace and so on, Robin sees this as liberation from the private rulers. Because if the workplace becomes safer and so on, if there's health care out in the world, if there is a social safety net, then it empowers workers to make greater demands in the workplace. So he likes that framing of freedom better than this more passive framing of freedom here. He thinks it's a better competitor with the strong frame that conservatives have, that state intervention is a constraint on liberty. Okay, we can return now to some of the polling data. Take a look. What's in a word? Socialism. Remember, the Republicans have an overwhelming negative response to that word, more split between Democrats. The picture's the reverse for capitalism. Republicans have more favorable attitude towards the concept of capitalism, but again, the Democrats have split here. Over here we see the bigger the bar here would mean that that issue more clearly differentiates the liberals and the conservatives. So social safety net, of course, liberals embrace the social safety net. Conservatives are critical of the social safety net. Environmental policy, we'll say more about that later. Labor unions, right? So the Democrats and the liberals more favorable towards unions, and Republicans, conservatives less favorable. Equal opportunity, right? So minority programs. So remember, the idea then was for Cory Robin was that these social safety net policies will empower the worker to stand up to their bosses in the workplace, right? Because if there is universal health care, if there is unemployment insurance, if there are food stamp programs and so on, then you can be a little bit more bold and assertive in the workplace, right? So for Robin, that's an empowering position. And so from the liberal point of view, that fits with this idea of emancipation, emancipating workers in the private realm of the workplace. And the way that can happen, one way it can be enhanced, is to have a social safety net that makes it so that the workers can be a little bit more bold in the workplace. Okay, let's finally take a look at gender. Remember from the 2012 for Republicans, not much of a gender difference in who identifies with the Republican Party. In contrast, the Democrats from 2012, there seems to be a stable gender gap, right? So 41% male, 59% female. We'll call this a gender gap. And so I want to show you some data that looks at how far back does this go, this gender gap. And this is work by Anna Greenberg, and she just went back all the way to 1952. So the yellow is the Democratic women, the red is the Democratic men. And the blue, Republican women, green, Republican men. Now notice over time, around about the 60s, there is a drop-off in Democratic affiliation with men. So men are leaving the Democratic Party. Now, she argues there are a couple reasons for that, because around this time in the 60s and later, the Democratic Party itself started to adopt policy positions where there were more differences between men and women, like the role of government in people's lives, defense spending, right? Women tend to be less favorable towards spending a lot on defense or aggressive use of force. Gender domestic roles, protecting the environment. Women tend to embrace more environmental regulation and so on than men. But there is, of course, another one that is likely relevant, and that is race factors. So in other words, in the 60s with the civil rights movement, it's right after that that you see white men leaving the Democratic Party. And in terms of the party platform of the Democratic Party, it began to take on policies that were targeting minorities, affirmative action, for example, integration, Medicaid for poor people. But to the extent that minorities were disproportionately poor, white males could have seen this as that the Democratic Party was beginning to favor people other than themselves, right? And that gets back to Cory Robin's argument about the transition from a superior status in society to a perceived subordinate position in society.